Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and today I want to have a look at the country's view of debt now that we appear to be passing the worst of the COVID crisis. I want to look at some of the problems the COVID pandemic has caused and some of the possible solutions to these problems. Now, joining me today is somebody who has a company who specialise in the spectrum of debt management. And very pleased to have with me Byron Crellin, Managing Director of Debt Squared Group, who we're going to chew over these facts and see what we can come up with, see where we are. Yeah. What is the overall picture for commercial property with debt at the moment? We're hearing so many shops closing down. We're seeing people working from home, obviously not using their office space. Factories are partially shut. Is this causing a debt problem within the commercial world?
Absolutely. Ticking bomb for some portfolio landlords and agents. We're a big fan in terms of data analytics because it helps us predict and work with our clients to determine where distress is. And we gather from across all market sectors across the UK data, and that helps us understand footprints in terms of company formation, businesses going into some form of insolvency, etc., by market sector. And it's quite interesting that in a pandemic, Q4 2020, it had the highest spike of business creations, formation in company's house. Now, that would suggest that business owners may be saddled with debt or going through what is a pre-pack exercise, or actually not taking advice and just creating a new co-company and moving their assets and leaving the shell company with the debt. There's a lot of landlords out there and a lot of agents that don't use data to track portfolios and react to the data that comes with that. I think there's a danger in doing that, and I think the lessons that will be learnt from COVID is that data is a virtual tool. It's the virtual credit controller. It provides a proactive viewpoint in terms of how portfolios are trading, and again, that's retail, industrial, etc. So it can go across any spectrum in terms of the UK market. But I think it's important that landlords and managing agents in the commercial space understand where a business is in distress. Is it recoverable? And if it's not recoverable, use data to act more promptly. So we work with a number of clients in terms of identifying where distress is, and then engagement with that tenant in terms of looking to mitigate the exposure to the landlord ultimately.
Yes. Is there a difference between the small commercial landlord stroke investor and the institutions? Are they taking different paths?
Yeah, I think smaller landlords, it's a very personal relationship. And again, we represent both. I think both would argue and say, if they were sitting here, that they're very in tune with their tenants. But I think common sense is that if you're a small landlord managing your own properties, or you're a landlord and you're using an agency, but that is your revenue, you know your tenants but by name, and you're tracking the performance of your portfolio and working with them. I've seen a number of our clients who are in that sort of category, providing rent-free periods, talking about turnover rent, which is an interesting debate in itself. Does it work? How do you manage it? Some of the bigger funds, I think they would say that they're probably very now in tune with tenants in terms of COVID has said, the restrictions are, if they didn't pay, your options were to, instruct a debt squared to recover the debt or to take possession of a property. Now, because those tools aren't available, well, they are, but within certain parameters, it is also almost a forced hand to engage. And I think, from looking at our client portfolio, I think they've done that very well in both sides, and tenants have had a willingness to engage, and I think that's actually created that landlord-tenant relationship. But undoubtedly, there are there are percentages in that within the landlord-tenant relationship where there is no engagement. There are tenants that are refusing to pay rent, and the landlord, is restricted in terms of what they can do.
Byron, I said in the introduction that you effectively manage the whole spectrum of debt management, as it were, and I have to tell you that's part of the reason you're on the programme, because you do take a very responsible and very considered view to the work that you do, and here on Property TV we're always very appreciative of that on behalf of our viewers and those who watch, to get instruction, advice and guidance, and that's what we're here for to a degree. And it's very pleasing to hear somebody who does not just get to the end result by whatever means necessary, which I think has in the past been some of the sort of heavy-handed actions of landlords.
Yep. Yeah.
And life is changing.
Absolutely, and I think we are reasonably unique in the sense that we are this enforcement recovery business, and we're looking after sort of the vacant properties that are on the increase. But we come at it from a different perspective, in the sense that we are using data to help landlords and tenants mitigate the potential of further distress in terms of arrears. So using that as a tool, it becomes effectively a real bond aspect, and I think we are a tri-party arrangement between landlord, tenant and ourselves.
Yes, well that's good to hear, and very, as I say, very considered view. Let me ask you, commercial debt from tenants, is it better or worse than you expected at the moment?
This might be an odd answer from a debt recovery company, but I actually think, and I can sense my clients and the market going, what? I actually think that it's actually not too bad, in the sense that because of the restrictions on landlords in terms of you can't use the commercial rent arrears recovery to collect rent in terms of default through ourselves, you can't take possession unless there's a breach of the lease, etc., etc. It's actually forcing landlords and tenants to engage. There are arrears, and there are arrears that reflect a pandemic. So they are, from a spike comparison, it's that because of a pandemic and because businesses have been forced to close. However, the interaction between landlords and tenants, I think, has been very positive. There's payment plans in place. There are a small nucleus of tenants that are evidently abusing the regulations, not paying rent.
It's always going to be the case, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, that's the frustration from certainly from our clients, that there is no remedy to penalise that. There has been recent legislation forced through where one particular well-known brand has been told to pay your rent, and that was a ruling through the High Court. So that's a win for the landlords. So
I think that was a leisure company, was it not?
Correct. And also a very well-known high street retailer has put forward a proposal for a CVA, a company voluntary arrangement, and that was rejected by a lot of landlords because they wanted to move from their rent as per the lease to move to turnover rent. And the condition, the proposal around the CVA was, if you don't accept that, then this business is going to fall over, and there was thousands of jobs at risk. And this is a national retailer that we'd all know. And again, it's in the public domain. You'd be able to, the High Court ruled, I think it was last week in fact, that the CVA could proceed on a turnover rent basis. Now that could be a landmark for landlord tenants.
Right. Well, let's just talk about turnover rent for a moment. In my other life as a property consultant, I've dealt with one or two people that have sort of fallen foul of that in their lease. It's been put in as an alternative to a rent, whichever be the greater.
Yeah.
And of course, the difficulty is that a turnover rent has to be supported by audited accounts, which are by nature 12 months behind the event.
Yeah.
So the landlord's waiting for 12 months to see. It's often used by the tenant to say, well, we can't set the rent yet because we've got to wait 12 months for the accounts.
Yeah.
And then in those companies that are unfortunate to have their lease running for perhaps 10 or 12 years, sometimes the lease specifies accounting procedures which are now outdated and certainly wouldn't work with digital VAT control, for instance. So it's not an easy solution, is it?
No, absolutely. Turnover rent has always been a pushback from the clients that I've spoken to for the reasons that you've said. It's unknown. Commercial rent arrears recovery as a recovery tool stipulates within the legislation that the rent must be certain, i.e. it's an amount, it's a qualified amount, it's not an amount that's calculated and therefore that's the debt. Basic rules, basic guidance for anybody considering turnover rent would be agree a base rent, so have a base rent in place, sit down with the tenant, engage with accountants, etc., go through the business plan projections. Is the business plan going to work? Is it realistic? And then agree what a percentage. Now, there is actually a trend, and it's around about 7% on turnover rent. And because of the issue of, well, I'll pay, but you've got to wait for the accountants to produce management accounts, etc., so there's this lag. Typical turnover rents today will have within the agreements what's called a certificate, and the tenant, through their financial advisors, through their in-house accountants, would issue a certificate that says here's a statement of fact, and then if they are, let's say, being not complete with their,
shall we say, cautious
with their turnover, then the certificate is the leverage that the landlord can then use that in terms of a prosecution and an action against the tenant. So it's interesting whether turnover rent will become the future, because the government are going through this phase back in terms of the COVID regulations that are in place in terms of around commercial rent arrears. They've said that they're going to phase it back. We're waiting for the update on the 30th of June to see what happens next. I generally believe that the government are looking at this in a longer term picture. Will they abolish commercial rent? Will we go to turnover rent? What's the remedies that are going to be available for landlords going forward in terms of recovering that? So this is a real move in the landscape now, and I think that as little as 3 years ago, turnover rent was never going to happen. Now it's on the table.
Okay, thank you. Well, there we are. That's the first half of the show. Join myself and Byron again after the break, when we'll be discussing some of the remedies that are being put in place by the government to try and assist landlords, and of course trying to assist tenants too. Okay, see you after the break. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and joining me is Byron Crellin, Managing Director of Debt Squared Group. Byron, welcome back. Look, in the first half of the programme we talked about the various types of debts that are arising out of COVID and some of the difficulties. Now, what we've got is this new government initiative called Debt Respite by the government. Would you like to explain to our viewers a little bit about this?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to it. So if we split it, so let's talk about commercial first.
Yeah.
So this legislation came in on the 4th of May. It is only available to individuals, so sole traders, and the criteria is they can't be VAT registered. Okay, so it's just purely individual sole traders. You don't need to have multiple debts. There is no qualification of I'm in so much debt, so therefore I can have this requirement of legislation. And what is the requirement? So the requirement is that this is a cooling off period. It's a 60-day period of time where a landlord or any creditor can't communicate to the party, to the individual. That's by telephone, by email, by text, and the individual is ring-fenced from making any payments. So how do you get into a respite period? So you either go through your local authority or you'll go to a independent citizens advice bureau setup, and you would sit down with them and go through an interview process, and they would determine whether you would qualify for this cooling off period. What's key is that you can only have this respite period once a year. So this isn't a case of, oh, I think I'll have another 60 days off. It's not a rolling aspect. It's 60 days and that's your lot. And it's actually reviewed at 30 days as well. So once you're into that process, you've got this period. And it's not a period of, I've got 60 days not having to pay anybody. It's 60 days of negotiation.
To create a solution.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. Engagement. And I think it's more built towards individuals that have been impacted as a result of maybe being furloughed, unfortunately losing employment as a result of COVID. And so therefore it was very much, when it was first as a draft consultation, it was read as very much a case of looking after an individual and their home and the family, and not necessarily from a commercial aspect, but it sits in the commercial aspect where you've got those sole traders. If you're an individual in a residential property, the same principles apply in terms of it's 60 days, you can only have it once a year, and you have that 30-day period. The key thing for it to work is engagement with all your creditors, and you can do that directly or through an independent party that can represent you and go through your finances. So it's like a debt management kind of exercise.
Okay. Let's just roll back on that a second. So first of all, the qualification is that you mustn't be VAT registered. I've forgotten what the level is now. Is it 80,000 for VAT registration? Because I think that's a fairly low threshold, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that really does mean that it's intended for, as you say, the small sole trader, and that's probably a good thing. Once they've been through this process of talking to the local authority or a local authority funded body like, as you say, Citizens Advice, do they then move on to an insolvency practitioner, for instance, or who would supervise the period?
So it would either be the local authority or the independent debt advice bureau. So they would manage on behalf of the individual and engage with, so they would communicate out. So it would be an engagement exercise at that point by the party representing the individual, whether it be commercial or residential, and they would typically be setting out a debt management repayment plan.
Right. And does it apply to residential property tenants or owners as well as commercial ones, even at the lower level?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I say, when it first was in draft consultation, it very much read as a document that this was for an individual within the residential market space to be protected if they were defaulting on their debit cards, defaulting on mortgage arrears, etc. This respite period is this cooling period where you can go into your debt management, break down what your income is for the next period of time, what your liabilities are, and then engage with all your creditors. And I think most creditors all want to be sympathetic and work with individuals, providing that the individual and what's being presented is realistic.
Yes. I was going to ask you if in fact this sort of scheme is welcomed by the sort of institutional landlords and the bigger sort of property owners, but of course they're not likely to have the smaller sole trader tenants, are they? It doesn't fit their profile of a suitable tenancy, really, does it?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the bigger funds possibly will have 1% impact on their investments. This is more sort of for the middle management and sort of very much the regional landlord-tenant one-on-ones.
Well, I suppose in one way it's a sort of smaller and limited version of the American Chapter 11, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
It's just that, really.
And I also think that this is very much a local authority opportunity to step in and work with the individual in terms of their requirements. And show a sympathetic demonstration and work with them to get them through this process.
Well, I'm sure a great number of local authorities are suffering through non-payment of business rate, aren't they?
Yeah. So bringing them to the table, no payment hurts. Bringing them to the table and going through some kind of debt management process and repayment schedule is a positive, because it's a solution. Of course, what you have got, and as you said, you mentioned about insolvency, what you have got is where you've got an individual that may be so far down as a result of their business or their personal situation has imploded as a result of COVID and you know, a loss of employment, etc. That might then go through the insolvency process and go into personal bankruptcy.
Well, that would be stage 2, wouldn't it?
Correct. Yeah, and I think this is very much a case of by the government to try and head those off, get people talking about their problem, because obviously, you know, what we have to take into account is it's a very personal, stressful time for any individual to be in debt. COVID has forced a lot of people that never thought they would probably be in that kind of situation into that position, new territory, very stressful. You know, got a young family or something like that, or you know, you've just moved house, etc.
Sure.
You know, so you've got to be mindful of that in terms of why the government have done this, and work with the individuals to try and get them through the other side.
Right. Okay. And tell me, Byron, do you think we've got various initiatives going on at the moment? We've had the protection for the bigger tenants in commercial properties. We've got this new Respite initiative. Do you think all this will be forgotten shortly and we'll go back to the normal court processes for debt recovery? What's the longer term prospect of all this help and
It's
assistance?
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because you know what we have got in the county court is a huge backlog.
I think it's about 300,000
yeah,
or something, isn't it?
Yeah. Q1 of 2021, there were over 270,000 businesses captured as in severe distress, which from a 30 years experience looking at that goes insolvency, unlikely to come back, severe distress. And I think you're going to have legacy. I think 2021, 2022 is still going to be the aftermath of COVID, providing we come out of it successfully, and we are getting back to work, and offices are opening up, and cities are coming back to life again. You are going to have a legacy debt, and I think the government are looking, and it'd be interesting to see what they do at the end of June, which is the next update in terms of arrears, and allowing landlords to take action, residential and commercial, across the UK. Whether they ring fence those arrears to try and provide a further protection and say, right, we start again and go fresh, but you're going to have to negotiate with these arrears. We're going to make it exempt from some form of enforcement and legislation. But the High Court are lobbying to say, look, let us alleviate some of the bottleneck that's in the county court, which I agree. I think that's a sensible approach. I think you've got companies like ourselves, where we could be bombarded with instructions, but actually, are they recoverable instructions? Because you've got to go through that process to understand that actually it's great having a bucket load of instructions, but actually, as a commercial business,
well, it's like having a book full of properties to sell as an estate agent, and there's no market.
Correct.
It's
Correct.
just the
Absolutely.
same, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But I mean, we're getting inundated with calls from people at the moment who are very keen to, you know, use property TV to get themselves exposure, to make people realise they're back in business and open and ready to go. And I think a lot of people are anticipating hitting the ground sort of running, getting business going again. But I do wonder if there'll be a second wave of insolvencies or difficulties when it comes to sort of paying back the bounce back loans and the extra monies that have been borrowed here, there, the rents that have been what's the right word, postponed, I suppose, or delayed?
I think it's a matter of when it'll happen. I think insolvency practitioners are on standby for this wave, and that might be businesses that just fall into that insolvency, but also if we go back to looking at company formations in 2020, you know, I mentioned earlier that, you know, we had a spike in terms of company formations. In a pandemic, that's unreal, and that could be just businesses getting advice. There's a lot of businesses out there at the moment. I think the old-fashioned term was ambulance chasers, where they're chasing the debt. But you've got businesses out there that will be hemorrhaging and will either be going through what's called a pre-pack exercise through an insolvency practitioner and being born again. I think there's a recovery process underway. I think there's going to be a legacy, certainly taking us into 2022, 2023 maybe. I think there's a lot of debt that's going to be unrecoverable.
Okay, and in the last 10 seconds, what's the bank's attitude to all this debt at the moment? Are they being rather more friendly than they have been in the past?
I don't want to get into trouble, but when I jumped in my taxi at Euston to come across here, the taxi driver was telling me that he'd had to draw money down from his house to pay off his arrears because he'd spent 2 weeks with no fares. And the bank was, okay, you can have a period of time, but we'll apply an element of interest. And after 3 months, the bank were calling it in.
Oh dear. Okay, well, on that cautionary note, that's all we've got time for today. So big thank you to Byron Crellin from Debt Squared Group. Join me again next time on Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin. See you then.